we have on our Old Testament survey. It's also going to be the last class that we are going to have on the actual books of the Old Testament. Next week, Kevin is going to talk about the intertestament period to kind of set the stage for the Gospels, because a lot of times we kind of skip over that period, and knowing the events that happen, the political, the cultural, the geographic context of that time helps a lot to understand some of the parts of the gospel. So today we're going to be looking at biblical poetry, focusing on the Psalms, on Lamentation, and the Song of Songs. So basically what we've been doing up till now has always been looking at what has God been doing? How has God been shaping his people to be salt and light, to be the people through whom God brings his blessings to the world? And where we left off with the narrative was that God's people, the people of Israel, still have a heart of stone. Okay, they get back from the exile. They have been cured of their idolatry, but we have seen that they still have a heart of stone, and they still cannot follow the covenant. And we've been looking at how do we change that. And last week, Kevin talked about the wisdom books, so Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, and how those books talk about what a good life is, and how to live life that according to God's will. And so, similarly to how the wisdom books work, the poetry in the Bible does the same thing. It aims to address the problem of the heart, and we're going to look at how that works. So we're going to start with a quick introduction to biblical poetry, and to see what it is. Now, did anybody take poetry classes in like at a college level, like at advanced poetry classes or basic stuff like that? High school level? Anyone? A few? So so if you know anything about English poetry, it's going to be unfortunately a little useless when it comes to biblical poetry, because obviously it's translated from different languages, and conventions of things like meter and cadence and stuff like that aren't the same as for us in English or in a modern language. So the goal of poetry, what it is, and modern poetry is the same way. It aims to fire up our imagination, and also to get us to think differently about events. So if you look at the narrative portion of the Bible, there's often points where the story is told, and then all of a sudden one of the characters will break out in song and retell what just happened, but using poetry and imagery. Think about the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, and then immediately Moses breaks out into song, and so does Miriam. And they retell what just happened, but they do it through a different lens to help us to think differently about what's happening, and to have a better understanding, specifically of how God is at work in those events. So the structure that we see in biblical poetry is typically free prose. So there's not really meter, and there's no real rhyming conventions in biblical poetry. The structure that is used, however, is a structure of couplets. So you typically will have one line that introduces a concept, and then the next line will develop it. So typically these things they will complete, they will deepen, they will contrast, they will develop whatever's being said by adding layers and layers of imagery. And if you've ever read the Psalms, you'll find that they are somewhat repetitive. They repeat themselves. And this is purposeful. It includes there's patterns of refrains, inclusios, chiasm, forward symmetry. All of these things help us to go over it again and again and again. Not only are these memorization techniques, but they also help us to meditate on Scripture, to keep it in the forefront of the mind. So the biblical poetry is meant for a lifelong meditation.
Jordan.
Yes.
What do those two words in the middle mean? Inclusio and...
Yep. So an inclusio, we'll talk a little bit, we'll give you an example of it later, but an inclusio is when you have a theme at the beginning and at the end that kind of sandwiches the theme. So you'll see that a lot in the Psalms, where it starts with a theme or an idea. It develops that idea throughout the psalm, and then it repeats that idea throughout. Chiasm is, the best example I can give, if I'm not mistaken, it's a form of comparison, but with comparing and contrasting to it. Yes. You don't necessarily need to know all these terms. The more you look at the Psalms and trying to look at it with not just what is the Psalm saying, but looking at the structure, the more these start jumping out at you. The other thing about it is imagery and metaphor. Some of it's going to be very familiar to us. So it's things like light and dark. Okay? Light represents what is good. Darkness represents evil. We're very, very familiar with that. And some of it is less familiar. So one of the things that you see a lot is the idea of chaotic waters and evil compared to the sea or a raging storm. Which represents danger and chaos, both natural and human. That's often contrasted with the idea of the high rock, which is the safe place above the raging seas. And why this is important is because this echoes creation. Okay, during creation, God is bringing order to chaos, and when he separates the seas to create the dry land where life can happen. And so biblical imagery refers back to the earlier biblical narrative. So the narrative helps us understand the imagery, and then the imagery deepens our understanding of the narrative, and it works in a cycle. And so we keep on, so as we reflect and meditate on biblical poetry, you get basically a feedback loop that cycles into itself and deepens our understanding of who God is and what he's done. So that's a bit of an introduction. Now, biblical poetry is found in narrative books of the Bible. Like I said, we often have times where some of the characters will break out into song. It's found a lot in the prophets, especially when they talk about God's judgment. There is a lot of imagery that's used. But for today's lesson, we're going to be focusing on the three books that are exclusively poetry. So starting with the book of Psalms, which has a purpose of an idea. It's building a temple of praise to God. So when we look at Psalms in general, first off, we see that it's got many authors. Most of them are attributed to are Psalms of David, but there's also many songs of Asaph, who probably was part of the priesthood, who were dedicated to worship. The sons of Korah, we know that they were basically the temple's choir. Some are anonymous. There's a few that are from Solomon, some from Moses. So there's many authors. They were mainly meant for choir worship in the temple. Now, the Psalms come from different periods of the history of Israel. Some of them we know exactly what they are for. So, for example, some of the Psalms of David give us a specific, hey, David composed this psalm when this event happened. Others are more general. So these were the book of Psalms was actually our best archaeological evidence is that the book of Psalms in its current form was put together during the Second Temple period. So all of these psalms that existed previously were taken together and gathered and put together to form a single collection at that point. And the important thing to think about is that the Psalms are not meant to be a songbook. Okay, it's not meant to pick and choose one at a time. The book of Psalms was meant to be read as one continuous book from beginning to end, and we will see how the different books of the Psalms develop ideas and patterns together.
Jordan?
Yes.
But there are certain psalms that are psalms of lament. There are certain
Yes.
that have different, character to them.
Yes.
Like like the middle part of the Psalms of Ascent.
Yes.
Those are psalms to be, when you're going up to the temple.
Yes.
So I'm, having a hard time saying that you have to do them all together.
So some psalms are, for example, those psalms, like the Psalms of Ascent, have a specific purpose. But if we look at them in context, when the book is put together, the psalms have a progression throughout the entire thing. And we'll talk a little bit about it, but the psalms start mostly with the Psalms of David, but they start in a place of more lament. But then as we move forward through the book of Psalms, the Psalms change and become more and more joyful, and it culminates with the Songs of Ascent of going to the temple. And because most scholars believe that the Psalms were put together during the Second Temple period, this brings us to this idea of God has been restoring his people. And at the end, we get to the Songs of Ascent. So we are moving towards the temple during this.
They don't go all the way to the end. It's just like they're, like
But
14 of them. That,
We'll specifically talk about the Psalms of Ascent when we look at the books. So let's look at the structure of it all together. So Psalms 1 and 2 form an introduction to the entirety of the book of Psalms. Psalm 1 has a 5-part structure, and this echoes the law. So the idea of Psalm 1 is that the Psalms, their purpose is going to be to teach the people the law again through prayer. Okay? So this gives us the Psalms 1 and 2 will give us the purpose of the Psalms. First is to remember the law. And this in Psalm 2, it reflects on the promise of the Messiah, the promise that God gives to David. So this introduces the two main ideas, which is that this is a book of prayer, first off, to learn the law of God while awaiting for the new king. So this is what the book of Psalms is going to develop. So if we look at the first book, it has So that inclusio structure, which means we have an idea at the beginning and that same idea that's at the end, and then it sandwiches ideas in the beginning. So book 1 starts with a call to faithfulness. And the first Psalms are a reminder first of God's faithfulness, and then how do we answer that? The next few Psalms are the Psalms where David, the Psalms of deliverance, how God has acted in David's life and how he has been elevated to a new king. Bringing us to a middle part, which is Psalm 19, which is a meditation on the law and how it is good. And this is where it gets interesting. The book of Psalms will contrast how God has delivered David. And then the next few Psalms, after Psalm 19, we'll develop this idea of God is going to bring about a new king to deliver his people. Just as God delivered his people through David, we're looking in the past to David, and then after we're looking in the future to the new king who will deliver his people. And it ends with a call to faithfulness once again. The second book in Psalms mainly speaks of the hope of a restoration of the temple and a return to Zion. And it contrasts that with the hope of the future reign of the Messiah and how this will fulfill the promise made to Abraham. Not just to give a land and to make Abraham's descendants into a great nation, but to bring blessing to all the nations. So the Psalms will often have this idea of looking back, how has God been faithful? What has God done? And therefore looking forwards. How is God going to be faithful in the future? Knowing who God is and his character, what has he done? What is he going to do? The third book mainly develops the promise of the new messianic kingdom, the promise of the messianic kingdom given to David. But remember, this is during the Second Temple period that these books are collected and placed in a specific order. And so, at this time, there is no king from the line of David that is ruling over Israel. So, in Book 3, we see these pleas of God that he would remember his promise in the midst of exile. In Book 3, you have, for example, several of the Psalms that talk about God restoring his people, bringing the captives back to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. Okay, Book 4 talks about, it's once again a plea to God to show mercy to a people who can't and won't follow him. And it contrasts this with Psalms that describe God as king and all of nature, on all of creation, worshiping God. And so it contrasts that with the idea is like God's people can't worship him. They are a fallen people. They cannot make the first move to be right with God. But however, creation itself worships God throughout Book 4. The fifth book, once again, we've had books 3 and 4 that are pleas to God. God, remember your promises. Book 5 affirms that God hears the cries of his people and he will destroy evil once and for all. And the latter part of Book 5 has the Hallel and the songs of ascent. So Hallel, praise the Lord. And what we have there is once again developing this idea of the promise of the messianic kingdom, with once again a meditation on the law and then focusing once again on the promise of the new kingdom. So this echoes back to what we saw at the beginning. So we see that there is structure within each psalm, there is structure to each book, and then there is structure to the entirety of Psalms. And then Psalms concludes with the last few Psalms, 146 to 150, which talks about how God is going to raise a horn to save his people. And this echoes Hannah's psalm from way back in Samuel, how God is going to lift up his people. And what we see throughout the Psalms is this tension between lament and praise. At the beginning of the book of Psalms, psalms of lament are more common. But as we progress through the book of Psalms, the songs of praise become more common. And what this tells us is that lament is an appropriate response to evil, to pain, and to suffering. However, we are reminded that a life that is transformed by God looks forward to the future with hope. Because of God's past faithfulness, we can look forward and say that God will be faithful. And so we have this tension in the book of Psalms between lament at how evil and pain and suffering still exist in the world, but balancing that out with faith that God is at work and God is sovereign, and that things that happen, nothing that happens hasn't passed through God's sovereign hand. So that's the structure of Psalms. I know it was pretty technical, but if we look at the book of Psalms and we look at how the people of the New Testament, when they pray and when they worship God, we see that their life is shaped by the Psalms. When Mary offers her song of praise to God, we see bits and snippets of the Psalms throughout it. She kind of does a greatest hits of the Psalms and brings it all together. And so we see in the lives of God's people how this focus on praise and worship and prayer has a transformative power in our lives. So once again, working on that heart of stone, making that heart of stone a heart of flesh that is able to love and to follow God. So that's for the book of Psalms. Lamentations. I know that we were there last week, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. So Lamentations, it's a pretty hard book to read. And what it mainly deals with is this idea of wrestling with God. Wrestling with God, wrestling with pain, and with suffering. So the premise of Lamentation, this is in the midst of the greatest catastrophe that has happened to Israel. The temple has been destroyed. So it feels like all of the promises are gone. The people of Israel no longer have their land. The promised land has been taken over. They've been scattered throughout the nations. They are no longer a great nation. The line of David is broken. God's presence no longer exists in Jerusalem, and the priesthood has been abolished and broken. So to the people of Israel at this time, it felt like God has forsaken all of his promises. And what lament allows for, biblical lament, is a way of protesting injustice, of shining light on what is wrong. God's people use it to process emotion, and it is a place to voice confusion at what is going on. in the light of tragedy, being able to say, to come before God and say, why? Why is this happening? And so what lament does is it restores dignity to human suffering. Not because suffering is purposeful or good, that's not what it is, but because um, but because we can process it and be honest with God. God accepts the lament of His people, and through it, it brings dignity um, when we can bring it before God. So the Book of Lament is divided into 5 poems. So the 5 chapters are 5 poems. The first one is about the grief and shame of Zion, and it compares that grief to a funeral. The imagery that is used is funeral imagery. That that Lady Zion is mourning over the destruction of the city. The second poem talks about the fall of Jerusalem and the wrath of God. So it talks about how the destruction of Jerusalem and God's judgment, this is not capricious. This is not God being mean or cruel. This is God's response because of Israel's unfaithfulness. The third poem speaks of the suffering one. And so this part here echoes other laments from different parts of Scripture. It recognizes that the fall of Jerusalem is divine punishment, that God is at work through this. This is not random for this specific event, that the destruction of Jerusalem is God's act. And therefore there is still hope in God's faithfulness, because if God acts according to His justice, then we can be faithful that God will always act according to His justice and His faithfulness. The fourth poem speaks of the siege of Jerusalem, and it contrasts the past glory of Jerusalem with the present destruction to highlight just how bad things have become. Now, the previous the first four poems are very structured. They're alphabetical, and so they use the different letters of the Hebrew alphabet to give structure to the song. But the fifth poem, this prayer for mercy, is no longer alphabetical. This is purposeful because it highlights just how disordered and disorganized the thought of the writer of this song is. It's a communal plea for God to see His people suffering. So you have rich and poor, the people in power and not, they're all crying to God to see their suffering. And we have this tension, okay, that God is king forever, but it also ends in this balance of, God, why have you abandoned us? And so that's how lamentation ends, that this tension between faithfulness, that God is king over all and God is still in control. But how do we reconcile that with the present pain and suffering? And lamentation leaves that open. It doesn't give us the answer. It doesn't say, well, this is how we reconcile it. It doesn't say that. It says it's okay to struggle with this. It's okay to bring this before God. It's okay to ask questions. As long as faithfulness in God and trust in God is the ultimate answer, even if we don't know why things happen. So that is lamentation, and like I said, it's hard to read because you have these highs of great faithfulness and proclamations of great trust in God, but also the conclusion is God, it feels like you're gone. It feels like you're not here. So, yeah. But this is a part of our scripture, and this is a part of the history of God's people. And in some ways, it's kind of a forgotten art that that we may not have, that we might have, especially in the Western world, that we may have kind of lost the habit of. But we see that this is a common theme for God's people.
Jordan, just real quick before you
Yep.
move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
I think it's really neat, just going through, because you've really highlighted how prayer is connected to these two books, right? And one thing I hear, a decent amount when people are struggling with their prayer lives, like, I don't even know like what to pray for or how to pray.
Yes.
And when you look through Psalms, when you look through Lamentations, you see like it isn't specific. You can pray for a variety of things.
Yes.
But if you need ideas on how to talk to God, like it's there, right? He's given us that ability to read and see how others have communicated with him in the past, right?
Yeah, that is true. That is definitely true. So moving on from Lamentation, which is heavy, we move on to the Song of Songs, which is, why in the heck is this in the Bible? Because it is spicy. To say the least. In fact, in certain rabbinic traditions, you could not read this book until you were 30 and married, because it is explicit, and but it's still in the Bible. And the kind of the theme of the Song of Songs is God's good design for passion and desire. So the book starts off with talking about how this is a book of Solomon. However, probably not written by Solomon. Probably not. We know that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. However, we look at the lover and her beloved in this story. They are exclusive to each other, completely exclusive. Their love and desire and passion for each other blots out the rest of the world. So it's probably not. So if we look at the character of Solomon that he develops, it's probably it doesn't fit with someone who makes political alliances through marriage. So what this the way the way rabbis talked about this, about it being of Solomon, it's kind of like the idea of the Proverbs. The Proverbs are of Solomon. They're of the wisdom tradition, which is pretty interesting that the Song of Psalms is in this tradition of wisdom literature. And, so what this is it's an exploration of love and desire, with two main characters who are the beloved and her lover. So if you read through the entirety of this book, whereas the Psalms are very structured, even books like Lamentation is very structured, this book is all over the place. It goes from scene to a next. There seems to be very little connection between them. There are some themes that we do see repeating. These cycles of seeking and finding each other. The beloved is searching for her lover. The lover is searching for the woman, and they're trying to find each other. And as soon as they find each other, it talks about how wonderful it is to be together, and then switch to the next scene, and then we keep on going, and we get these cycles of passion that mount and that culminate, and then we move on to the next. And this truly explores the joy and the passion of physical attraction and sexual desire. That's We're not going to beat about the bush with this. The imagery, it's based more on meaning rather than description. If you were to kind of like make an artist representation of what the beloved looks like based on the description, we would modern women would not probably find that very flattering to have one's hair described as a flock of camel over the hills and things like that. But these are probably more cultural. Yes.
If I may, and I'll keep it short and sweet,
Yeah.
we've had a wonderful member of our church, lady. We've looked at this book in a little bit different way, if I can throw that out before I go do my job. If we can look at it as God being the lover, constantly seeking us, and we being the beloved, it can really change how you look at this book, and it not being, there obviously does at first glance, but now that I've looked at it from a different angle, I have a little harder time seeing it as a male and female lover as much as I have a little more devotion to the idea that it is God. And think about, as you just kept talking about how a scene goes, and then it goes, well, he pursued Israel, and then like, oh, we've been listening to it in the Old Testament. And then Israel got it together and said, you're the God, and then they forgot. So it is a bit of a failed and come again love relationship. And I just wanted to throw that out because I really think that might be what God's wanting us to see.
So you're 2 slides ahead
I'm
of me.
sorry.
But
I
yes.
knew I had to go, and I thought I have to say it.
Yes, definitely.
I apologize.
Yeah. So one of the ideas that's developed in this is that love is beautiful, but it's also dangerous. Just like fire will sustain life, it can also destroy. And this idea that we long to know and to be known. That ultimately love is a gift of God. So let's talk about interpretation. Okay, let's talk about interpretation. So there was the Jewish interpretation, the traditional Jewish interpretation, which is echoed in some of the prophets, is that the beloved is Israel and the lover is God, and that the love is a symbol of the law and God's enduring faithfulness. That God pursues Israel no matter what, and of that interpretation, we have the Christian interpretation where the beloved is the church and the lover is Christ. And Paul develops this imagery in his letters, and in the book of Revelation, we have that the culmination of Revelation is Christ marrying his bride, marrying his church. However, these are correct interpretations. However, recent archaeological discoveries in the last 20 to 30 years shows that this kind of poetry was actually pretty common at the time, this love poetry. And so that this is a part of Israel's heritage. While these are true, this idea, these parallels between how the characters are symbols for God and his people are true, it's also a reflection on the divine gift of love. And one of the really interesting things about the imagery that's used is that as it progresses, the lover and his beloved join together in the garden. And so true love, this love restores us to the garden. So there's garden imagery that permeates the book, and one of the ideas is that love can return this couple to the garden where they can be completely vulnerable and safe with one another again. The taint of sin that separates man from God can be removed. We go back to the idea that this is God pursuing his people, but also that taint of sin that separates man from the woman can go away. So, in conclusion, what can we take away from all this? So once again, poetry and imagery, it can deepen our understanding of God and His Word. And it allows us to engage with God's words on more than just an intellectual level. It allows us to use emotion and imagination in a good way, and to reflect on how those things bring us closer to God. So I really appreciate you guys staying with me. I know that we've been feeding you guys from a fire hose from these last few weeks. Next week it's going to be Kevin who's going to talk about the intertestament